because breakup of family, breakup of friends. The next morning I got up and I went back up to the mountain. And I stood on that cliff and I looked up to God and I said, God, do you remember me? And do you mind if I die? That's all I said. I didn't see a burning bush. I didn't see anything. I went back down the mountain and I was really angry. So I went to the chemist and I took some tablets and I OD'd that night. And I woke up the next morning very angry.
That you were still alive?
I was still alive. I was angry that I was alive. So I knew that if I walked up that mountain, this would be the last time. So I started to climb the mountain, but as I started to climb that mountain, this dog appeared. And as I'm walking up the mountain, and as I looked to the right, I could see this dog. It kept its distance, but it was there, and it was following me as I'm walking up this mountain. And as I approached the cliff, I knew I was just going to keep walking. But as I started to walk towards the cliff, and as I'm looking at this dog, it had disappeared. I couldn't find it, couldn't see it. So when I ended up standing on the edge of the cliff out of curiosity, looking around for this dog and can't find it, I looked down, right down to my left, and there was this dog right next to me, standing right next to me with a stick in its mouth. So I picked up the stick and I threw it, and the dog fetched it, and I played with that dog for hours up there. And I just went off into the forest with this dog. And this was winter. And in Scotland in winter, you're looking at minus whatever.
It's cold.
It's very cold. And I was totally lost. But you know what? I just didn't care. I didn't care that I was lost. And then that dog just turned around and just saw this unseen path, and I just followed it. And this dog took me all the way back to the foot of the mountain where my motel was. I went into the motel, and a thought came to my mind, and the thought was, Mark, you are a missing person. And I didn't realize at the time I'd been put on the missing list. And I picked up the phone, and I now phoned my ex-girlfriend, who got hysterical over the phone. And she asked for my phone number. And then I put the phone down, and about 10 minutes later the phone rang. And I picked up the phone, and it was Pastor Don Lowe. And Pastor Don Lowe, a good family friend of ours, he said, Mark, why don't you just pack up your things, get on the train, come to London, and live with me and my wife?
What a beautiful offer.
An act of kindness. How old were you then, Mark, while this was going on?
I was 24.
24.
Yeah.
In the prime of life, really.
Yeah. And I went to Pastor Don Lowe's house, and they threw their arms open at me. And Don said to me, he said, Mark, what's the worst time for your depression? And I said, it's about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I woke up at 5 o'clock that morning, and he was sitting at the end of my bed. I didn't know at the time, but I'd been told that he had contacted his son. And his son had said to him, Dad, promise never to preach to Mark. And I'd wake up every morning at 5, and he'd be sitting at the end of my bed. And I said to myself, this man cares.
Makes a difference, doesn't it? In the process of healing, having someone care for you is a great, great benefit.
It makes you realize that life is worth it. There are people that care.
I see also in your story of the dog, God saying, Mark, I'm here. I'm watching you. I'm following you. I'm here for you. And then when you look down and the dog's actually next to you, God is saying, I'm right here with you.
That's
And
right.
let's go and play.
Yeah, that's right.
Takes you away from the mountain, spends time with you, and then takes you safely back to where you were staying.
But I didn't know that at the time.
No, but that's the picture I get when you're talking about it.
That's
God
right.
is saying, you're not alone.
That's right.
Let's spend time together.
So day after day, you're in this company of these Christian people. Are you seeing now people who say they're Christians behaving like Christians?
I knew this man always loved me because his son was my best friend who left the same church the same time as me. And what I loved about him was, even though his son left the church, his love was even greater. And looking back, that's what I really wanted.
That's right.
And maybe that's why even today he calls me son. But after being there for a while, he said, Mark, he said, I so much want to help you, but I don't know what I can do to help you. He said, would you mind seeing a Christian psychologist? And I said, that'd be fine. Look, I had seen a couple before, and they said there's nothing wrong with your mind, but you're suffering greatly with childhood trauma. So I went to go and see Dr. Compton on a Thursday night, and I knocked on her door, and she opened the door, and she just stared at me. And it was very strange. When someone stares at you, you sort of recoil.
What are you looking at?
I thought, what you're looking at, is my hair wrong? Or she just stared at me, and then she apologized and said, Mark, just come in and sit down. And I went into her lounge and I sat down. And she said, I apologize for staring at you at the door. She said, but last night I had a dream. And in that dream, I saw your life. And you know what I said to myself? Yeah, sure. I didn't believe it at all. She said, God has told me that you're to tell me your life story, and at the most painful parts of your life, I will tell you what God was doing for you. I told her how I was a naughty kid. My dad would beat me with a strap. And I could handle that. But when I told her that my father threw me out of home, I started to cry. And she turned around to me and she said, in the dream, you walked from Brookmans Park Station to your father's home. I was in shock. How do you know the name of that station? And when you walked from your father's home, when you walked from the station to your father's home and he threw you out, while you were walking to that station, I saw Jesus walking with you. When she said those words, this amazing fire just rushed through my body. This love. You just have to experience it. Rushed through my body. It was incredible. An amazing experience. In a nano of a second, I'd hated God for so long, and now I just loved him with everything I had. Changed my life. It changed my life.
You know,
It's like the story of the footprints in the sand. At the hardest point, there's only one set of footprints, but that's because God is carrying you.
You know, through my life, you know how many people have sent me that? So many people sent me that through my journey of my teenage years. Would send me that so many times, and I would read it and put it down, and it would always say unknown author, and I was like, who wrote that?
You know, the Bible tells us that God says Jesus will not leave you or forsake you in the most darkest and trying hour of your life. Even though you may not see,
That's right.
God is there.
That's right.
And the tragedy is we're so caught up in our own emotions and our own thoughts. God is right there, and He's holding out His hand, Mark. And you know, it's just that we are so preoccupied. The devil has done a good job in taking our minds away from what really counts.
Yeah.
And so that experience it's a wonderful experience. So tell me, you went to this person and the counsellor, and
Yes.
and what happened after that?
I went back to Pastor Don Lowe's home and I told him, and he was very surprised. And a few days later, I got up to have breakfast and I noticed he had a suit and tie on. I said, "Oh, where are you going?" He says, "It's Sabbath, I'm going to church." And I said, "Could I come with you?" And he said, "Of course you can." I didn't realise he was taking the service that day. And he took the service at the church that I was brought up in.
Okay.
And I walked into church and people came up to me and said, "What are you doing here?" I was very surprised to see me because they knew that I hated God so much. And in Sabbath school class, I just said, then people asked me in Sabbath school class, and I said, "I've fallen in love with Jesus."
Yeah, one.
And they just looked at me, just astounded and in shock. That was the beginning of my spiritual journey. That was my beginning of understanding God. You see, as a child, I'd heard the pastor preach about Jesus. But what is that? I'd never experienced God. I'd never experienced Jesus. But now this was a new beginning and a new love that had come into my life.
In the New Testament, Paul writes, it's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. That's
Yeah.
in the book of Romans.
Yeah.
And it's when we actually look in God's face and see His goodness, see His love for us, that our hearts are finally, the hard stone in our hearts is finally broken. And He starts to be able to give us that heart of flesh that He promised.
That's right.
If we will but surrender to His love and be willing to love Him back,
Yeah.
that's where the change comes in our relationship. Even if we have been what we would call Christians for many, many years, it's not until we let go and let God's love penetrate into our hearts that we will love Him back. Not until we see in the Bible especially the love of God for us personally,
That's right.
that He's able to start to reach us.
That's quite right.
So were you working through this time, Mark?
Yes, I was a builder.
Yeah.
And at that time, I just got some work through the local Adventist conference. And I was working on one of the Adventist houses, one of the pastors' homes. And I was rebuilding a wall. And the pastor's daughter had come over from Australia. And she came out to make me a hot drink. And I thought, wow, that hot drink is so good. I wonder if she'd like to make that for the rest of her life for me. So I got talking to her, and she actually knew me from years ago at school. She used to go to school in the UK, and she actually remembered me. But I didn't remember her because when I was at school, I was looking at the older girls, not the younger girls. And anyway, we went out to dinner and we got talking. And about 5 days later, we flew off to the States to do some snow skiing with her father, which was just fantastic. And it was about 2 years after that we got married.
Okay.
So tell me whereabouts in this situation, I mean, you've spoken about going to the psychologist, of falling in love with Jesus. When was the time when you were in the depression and you just surrendered it all to God and said, "Heal me"? Whenabouts did that happen?
Okay, that's part of the progression of the story. What took place was, after being married, my wife had known me as a person that was suffering deep depression. And I explained to her that this is not me. I'm normally a very happy, bubbly, happy person. But my wife she just loved me no matter what. And she wanted to marry me. And she said, God has told me to marry you. And so we got married. But shortly after our marriage started to fall apart. Because I was very short-tempered. I was very grumpy. And in the end, I said, why don't we just split up? So she moved out of the home. She moved into London, and I stayed in the home. And the depression was just so bad, I just couldn't cope anymore. I just had enough. I just had enough of depression. I couldn't see a way out. I'd come back to God, but I still had this depression. My marriage had failed, and I was just at my wit's end. So I got in my car and I drove to Scotland. And I went back to that same mountain, but this time it was different. Because I stood on that mountain and I took 2 books with me. One was called The Desire of Ages and the other one is called The Great Controversy. The 2 most powerful books I've ever read in my life.
Yes.
And I held those books up and I said, God, if you heal me, I will work for you. And I meant that with every fibre in my body. I drove back to London. I went to sleep that night in the deepest sleep I've ever gone to in my life. And I woke up the next morning 100% cured.
Amen.
It's about 26 years ago. But then I had to go and find my wife. So I drove into London. I went and sat down, we had a chat, and I told her how I was changed, how God had changed me. And she said, men never change.
That's about right.
That's about right. Men never change. So I had to court her all over again, and we went out to dinner, and she sort of withdrew herself because she could see I was this happy, bubbly person. And she's thinking, I didn't marry this guy like this. I married a guy that was really depressed. And she's like, but this is the kind of person I always wanted in my life. And
She was sort of afraid that,
she was
that you were
afraid.
just going to fall back into
That's
the
it. She
other
thought
way.
maybe this is a trick to get me back or whatever. And I said, no. I said, God has healed me, and this is as I really am. You know, when God healed me that night and I woke up the next morning, it was like a cloud had lifted away from me. I saw the sunshine in my mind. I could see joy just coming out of me. It was amazing. You know what I did for 2 days? I just went to restaurant and ate food. That's all I did. I was so hungry. My body just wasn't